First thing I'd say is be comfortable with ambiguity. The art and science of medicine is changing exponentially on a daily basis, but I'm still teaching the same way and stuff that I did 7, 8 years ago. We've got to explore. We can't be doing things the way we were doing them 30 years ago, 20 years ago.
Hey guys, Seth Peterson. In this podcast, I chat with Carl DeRosa, who's the program director at Northern Arizona University, who's developed the first fully competency-based entry-level curriculum in the United States. In this episode, we talk about what CBE is, why there is such a massive shift outside of PT towards competency-based education, and touch on a motion coming up in just a few weeks at the House of Delegates. There's no doubt in my mind, whether you're in the clinic or in education, this is a massive shift that's coming in physical therapy. So buckle up and I hope you enjoy. So Carl DeRosa, thanks for joining us on the Hands On, Hands Off podcast. I know you a little bit from, both of us live in Arizona. You're up there in Flagstaff. I'm down in Tucson. But maybe we just start off the podcast if you could explain what your current role is, maybe introduce yourself. But you're kind of also one of these interesting chimeras in PT who've done a lot in terms of leadership. You've been in private practice and now education. You've done a ton. So if you can kind of go into maybe your journey in physical therapy and how you see yourself, that'd be great.
Sure, I'd be happy to, Seth, and I appreciate this invitation to just share some ideas and answer some questions. I was one of the founding faculty for the Northern Arizona University Physical Therapy program. That was way back in 1978, and there were no physical therapy programs in the state of Arizona. The Regents awarded Northern Arizona University the program to the surprise of many. I was recruited out of California where I was working, and three of us came at the same time, and we were literally given a blank checkbook by the university to put together what we thought would be an innovative program. It was an incredibly stimulating, exciting time. I was very young in my career. And I'd been working actually in long-term neuro rehab, and then was transitioning to orthopedics while I was in California before I came here. And they asked me to develop the musculoskeletal side of the curriculum, essentially, at Northern Arizona University. And then in 1981, I had the good fortune to meet a good friend, still a good friend, Phil Sauer, who studied with James Syriacs in England. And he was working down in Sedona. And so in 1980, we opened up a two-person private practice that was just focused on spine care, and sort of took the city by storm. The physicians had never really worked with any therapists that were just focused on spine care. And we grew that practice to a broader orthopedic spectrum, and went into a collaboration with physicians here in the community, where we actually built the first large-scale musculoskeletal center. It was an independent practice with the physicians in their independent practice. It had the first recovery care center in the state for surgery. And that just meant that instead of just being an ambulatory care center, that we could have patients stay there for 3 days. It's like a mini hospital in a way.
Oh.
So we built a revolutionary concept here in Arizona, and I was still at that time I was chair of the physical therapy program simultaneously, so there weren't enough hours in the day to do all this. So, but I found the hours. I chaired the program for 20 years, and just was fortunate, surrounded by some incredible physical therapy leaders: Tom McPoyle, Mark Cornwall, Karen Mueller. I just was lucky. I was working with a dream team in physical therapy faculty. So that's what was sort of keeping me busy with practice. We had practice for 41 years, and also running the program. And then about 3 or 4 5, 6 years ago, I was offered a position in the community to run the largest orthopedic physician medical practice in northern Arizona. They asked if I would serve as the CEO, running two surgical centers and managing physicians and PAs and everything. And I uh, I thought, that might be fun. I mean, people may say you're crazy, but I thought that would be fun. So I stepped away from the university and I told them I'd do this for 4 years. I wanted to do it, and I knew these physicians very well, and so I didn't have a learning curve on that. And just we had a really successful run, and then 4 years to the day I stepped out. I prepared for the transition, and then I was going to slow down a little bit. And then, in the immortal words of Michael Corleone, just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in. I had an opportunity to get involved with competency-based education. And that was at Rasmussen University. They were a competency-based education institution. And they gave me, it was sort of deja vu, they gave me a blank check to hire faculty. I hired 10 faculty, and we developed a curriculum that got accredited by CAPD and everything. And Rasmussen, wonderful experience for me. Well, we had accepted the first class; they had not started, but Rasmussen University, as a for-profit institution, got purchased by American Education Institute, and that's one of the largest for-profit companies. And their mission is not graduate education. So, long story short, they pulled the plug on the program, even though we had developed the first competency-based program. But my phone was ringing off the hook the next day from several universities with physical therapy programs that said, "Would you take and lift that and put it over here?" And one of those was Northern Arizona University. And so we had developed the total gamut of a competency and entrustment based program at Northern Arizona University, and we just completed the work we had started at Rasmussen University. So that's my short history. I hope I didn't go too long on that, but that's practice and education, and then some new ventures. I've served as in the House of Delegates for a long time. I think it was probably about 20 years. I was chief delegate for about 6 or 7 or 8 years, and was the chair of education for the APTA for a number of years. So dabbled in a lot of the different areas. It's been a great ride. Physical therapy has been very, very good to me.
Yeah, it sounds like it. That thread of craziness has kind of continued
Yes,
throughout all your different roles, though, I noticed.
I
So,
know. Yeah.
do you
Yep.
do you remember, Carl? I mean, you talked about Rasmussen and being drawn into that. Do you remember the first time you heard about competency-based education?
Well, it was actually, there was a lot of talk in the medical literature about competency-based education, and I knew from some early presentations, at our national conferences, there'd be isolated presentations on it, and I was intrigued by. I didn't know anything about it, but I was intrigued by it. But then I got into the medical literature more, and they really do try to control variation in practice, and patient safety is so big. And being a CEO for physicians, you realize how important safety and is, and we would have mortality and morbidity conferences for errors that were made. So the competency, the attention to competencies, what was really elevated, in the medical field. And then it was Rasmussen University contacted me when they were looking to start a physical therapy program. They asked if I would run a summit. Can you help us run a summit and bring in together about 10 physical therapy industry leaders, because our focus is competency based education. That's Rasmussen University, that's their focus, CBE. and we want to put a program here and bring in leaders and put together a physical therapy program along those lines. So I said I'd be happy to do that because I was intrigued by it, and I started to send them stuff, and they said, "Well, this is interesting stuff. You've been thinking about this for a while. How would you like to be chair of the program?" I didn't even apply for it. They just asked first. I was just going to run a summit, and all of a sudden I'm the chair of the program. And so it was really the stimulus for me was twofold. It was observing how important competency-based education and a competency-based framework was for medicine. I really understood why they were doing it. And it was developing from the ground up, a program at Rasmussen University. So that's the history of it. So I've been sort of living it, if you will, for a good 6 years now.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it. So what would you say if you had to kind of define what CBE is, what EPAs are? That's probably going to be important.
Yeah, I think first of all, competency-based education is fascinating because if you like to teach by using an assessment method, you know and a lot of people, that's how they like to teach. A lot of physical therapists, a lot of physicians like to teach like that. Not, I'm going to put lectures up of PowerPoint slides, not that kind of teaching, but this is having someone do something, correcting them on the spot, giving them feedback. And it's much more of a coaching model than a teaching model. So we sometimes say we learn by our mistakes. This truly is a way that you learn from your mistakes. You welcome errors. You welcome, in the educational process, because you coach people up. And so once you define the end zone, I always call it with the faculty, the end zone is the competencies, and that's the knowledge you have, and it's the skills you have, and it's the attitudes. I mean, basically the competencies are knowledge, skills, and attitudes rolled into one. And those, then how do you translate those into the actual workforce? That's what the EPAs are. It's really the tasks that we do at work that have embedded in them the knowledge, skills, and attitudes of that are the competencies. So the EPAs are really an exciting piece, I think, of this whole process. And it's not about measuring the EPA. If an EPA is taking a history and making a diagnosis, we do that every day. It's not about evaluating the student's performance on that as much as it is gaining them gaining their trust. That's what entrustment means. So it's more about the levels of autonomy that you give the learner in with EPAs than it is about, oh, you did it sort of well but not well. It's about trust, and trust is sort of black and white. You either give somebody the trust that you trust them to do it, and they can do it independently, or you trust them to do it with guidance or whatever. So that's why EPAs, I think, are really an exciting frontier for competency-based education.
Yeah, I mean, just to rephrase it, it sounds a little bit like, if I had someone in my clinic that was maybe a student or something, and they're demonstrating something, and then at that point, I feel like I'm good. At this point, you're good with this. I trust that you're going to be able to implement this with patients in my clinic. Obviously, I'm going to
Exactly.
protect those patients.
Exactly. And Seth, the beauty of the process is that traditionally in clinical ed, when we would watch a student with an encounter, a patient encounter, we'd watch the whole thing, you know, and then you try to sort of grade the whole thing. But this is a process where I can have if the APA is developing an exercise prescription or developing a management plan. Um, that's the only part really I've got to focus on. The EPAs are it's that particular EPA. And so now you give the student really meaningful feedback on very specific, discrete aspects of a patient encounter. And the history examination, the development of a prescription, the decision to delegate. You can watch part of what they do and let them go to town go to town with the rest of the patient encounter, but you just need to focus perhaps on one or two of the EPAs. And the way we've incorporated it in our program is that the student asks for the assessment. It's a very different process. The student will approach, if I'm the clinical preceptor, the student approaches me and said, I'd like you to assess me on EPA 3 or EPA 5, or I'd like you to assess me, today with this patient on EPA 7, and that's the conversation they're having. So our students come back, after the first clinical affiliation. I mean, a couple of the students had 100 EPA assessments that were all graded. And the question always is, oh my gosh, that's too much work involved with that for a CI. No, we actually developed a tool. It's on a phone. It's an app. And boom, 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 and it's real time assessment of the student doing that EPA. And this is not a plug, but we work with a company called White Coat Technologies that developed this tool for us that allows us to look in real time at the student's performance with EPAs.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, when I'm listening to you describe this, though, Carl, this is an AOM podcast. So I think that to me, having gone through fellowship, that sounds a little bit like post professional training. I mean, you didn't have
Well,
like an anatomy course and you didn't have, it was, could you do what you were supposed to do at a certain level?
yeah, that's exactly what it's like. And I think that there's a lot of good leadership, at the residency level of our profession, where they were looking at competencies and before entry level. I mean, they're ahead of the game. And so I think there was a lot of lessons learned in that process that to me are very reasonable to incorporate into entry level education. And I think that the thing that has been the other thing that's been fascinating to me about competency and entrustment based education is that it really, really does create a curriculum that's integrated. I think it's fair to say, if I ask any faculty member at any physical therapy program in the United States, is your curriculum integrated? Everybody would say, oh yeah, 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 it's integrated. We have an integrated curriculum. But the reality is the student has to figure out how to integrate all that, because everything is taught in more siloed courses. There's an anatomy course, there's an orthopedic course, there's a pediatrics course, et cetera, et cetera. Competency-based education forces the faculty to integrate the curriculum, to put unsiloed courses together, because you start with the end in mind. What's the competency you want? And then you work backwards to develop the curriculum based on the course learning outcomes that are aligned with those competencies. So it's a backward design process.
Yeah. And it sounds like that's kind of what you did at NAU, right?
Yes, exactly. That's what we did. And again, we had a head start. We had a little bit of a time before at Rasmussen with this team. And I just want to commend NAU. I worked there. I love the place, but they willingly hired all 10 of us. I mean, when Rasmussen pulled the plug, they on the spot hired all 10 of us as faculty members to continue our work in the competency and entrustment based process. And then we kept that going while we made the transition, the conversion from a traditional residential program that was not competency based, and now the residential side of our PT program is also fully in the competency and entrustment based curriculum. So it's sort of kept my juices going. It's been really an exciting couple and a half years here, building one from the ground up, which is one you got to have one set of strategies to build from the ground up. And then if you're going to convert a program that you have, there's another strategy. How you do the teach out of an older curriculum and implement a newer curriculum. So just fun times.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned how we're a little bit maybe behind some of the other professions, which we'll get into maybe in a minute, but I'd imagine that comes with some challenges. Did you get any resistance from faculty, or what sort of challenges did you run into?
Yeah, I think that the for the ground up one, and I've done a couple presentations at ELC, on this. Building from the ground up a little bit easier because hired faculty who were interested in doing this, so there was no inertia to overcome. Now, conversion one was it takes a different type of strategy, and what I've learned, and this is anecdotal, but the younger the faculty member is, the easier it is to make this conversion. In other words, the young faculty really are a little more adept at pivoting and changing. They haven't gotten set in their ways. I think faculty that struggled with it are faculty that have been maybe doing they've been teaching this anatomy course or they've been teaching this orthopedics course for the last 15, 18 years, and now this is a shift. Where did my orthopedics course go? It's now integrated in a patient management course, and there's an obligation in competency and entrustment-based education that everything is team taught, and we don't have any course in the curriculum where there aren't at least 6 or 7 faculty involved in it. Okay, now let me explain what that means, because you can see where the challenges are. Then is that you got 6 or 7 faculty involved in, and I'll just call it a patient management course. This isn't the type of thing where I come in, Carl DeRosa comes in, and I've got some expertise in the spine. I do my 2 weeks in the spine, and then I'm out. That's all I do, and I write a few questions for their exam, and I'm all done. I'm involved in that course the complete semester because I'm contributing to the assessment process for everything that we try to do what they call authentic assessments. You try to mimic using OSCEs and things like that, that are authentic assessments, and so I'm part of the whole course, even if it's not my area of expertise. So we've got 5 or 6 faculty working with 50 or 60 students, and it breaks down nice. I'm working with 10 students and doing the assessments. But that's a struggle for faculty who have a more traditional model where they just sort of did their thing, their area of expertise, and now they're assessing students in areas that are maybe outside their comfort zone. So I think that is probably one of the biggest challenges, is that the faculty member getting the understanding that this is more about assessment. This is assessment for learning, right? That's why we're doing the assessments. You're going to be involved with big courses. So and like I said, the young faculty, my experience has been, it's sort of like your kids. Okay, we'll do it, Dad. Yeah, that's what we'll do. Whereas your teenager goes, I'm not doing that. That kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, so I want to zoom back out a little bit in terms of what the profession's doing, because I think you're leading the game here. You're the first fully CBE program in the country, but I know that the profession's invested a lot in that. So maybe could you just give a rundown on what you know as far as why did we start investigating CBE and EPAs, and where are we right now from what you know?
Yeah. Well, there's been, I think I've been able to, as they say, sort of stand on the shoulders of a lot of great leaders. And we have had some individuals in education programs and residency programs really keep the conversation going. They've gone out, on the limb, um, trying to extrapolate from other professions that are leading the way, like veterinary medicine is like leading the way, pharmacy is leading the way, medicine leading the way, nursing leading the way. And so they really have called out and distilled out some of the wins that they've seen with these other professions, and made suggestions that this is something that physical therapy should seriously take a look at. This is the movement. It's almost an international movement. And again, if you think of the some of the original reasons why competency-based education has sort of taken foothold, it has a lot to do with patient safety and eliminating variation in practice. And we're typically in physical therapy, we don't have high risk safety things like medicine and surgery and and those type of things, but we do talk about unwanted variation in practice a lot. And competency-based education drills that down to the essential competencies, and you can't have faculty just teaching what they want to teach, what they're interested in. They have to teach around the competencies. So I think that there have been so many great lessons learned from the other professions, and we have some great leaders in physical therapy education that have pulled that and written about it, that they haven't been able to implement it at their institution yet, but they will. But they have written about it and stimulated the discussion, and really seeded the discussion to get us going. And then, like anything else, there's early adopters and middle adapters and late adapters. And I think we just had the good fortune of a team of people that wanted to be early adapters and make a mistake. I mean, wanted to make mistakes. We presented what we've done at several meetings already, um, primarily so people can critique it. And we just have gotten better by hearing the questions like, "Why are you doing that?" And then we go, "Well, I don't know. Why are we doing that? Let's switch that up." So that's how these things evolve. I'd like physical therapy to move a little bit quicker at it, because I think competency-based education solves a lot of the things that we've been, you know, talking the talk about, but haven't been walking the walk, on things like the efficiencies in the curriculum and unwanted variation. And what's really important to me is that this is the way to create that professional trajectory from an entry level student into more advanced practice residencies. And this is the route where it can happen, because the competencies are scaffolded. They're scaffolded at the entry level, and they're scaffolded at the residency level. And there's a clear professional pathway that we can develop as a profession, as we continue to embrace it.
So let's say, I mean, let's look over our shoulders. If we kind of imagine that we're in a race, where's the PT profession and where's medicine and pharmacy and veterinary medicine?
Yeah, I would say that when I was in high school, I ran the quarter mile because I wasn't fast enough for a sprint, and I couldn't run long distances. So the quarter mile was my race. So I would say, if you think of a quarter mile track, that medicine, pharmacy, um, um, veterinary medicine, nursing to some extent, are rounding that last curve and bringing it into that last 100 yards, 100 meters to come to the finish line. And physical therapy is probably still at about the 110-meter point. We're 200 meters behind the other professions, and not that we can't kick it in. We got to run that backstretch, but we have to run that backstretch a little bit faster. I think there's an expectation from the industry that physical therapy is, better turn on the jets a little bit down that back stretch. So I think that's the gap is pretty big to me. Not the gap of knowledge. I think we probably have the gap of understanding it, but the gap of implementation. is where we're rounding the first curve at 110 meters, and all the other professions are rounding that last curve to go to the end. So that's my track analogy where we're at.
Yeah, man, the 400, you ran the 400. That's like the toughest.
It
I
is.
mean,
Oh,
that's the toughest race in all of track and field.
oh,
Just imagine.
and that's it. And like I said, I just wasn't fast enough for the 100 or 220. And I, the mile, I get winded too fast, so that's where I sort of landed. But I actually ran the mile relay with a team when I was in high school, and we had the record at our school for a good 20 years. I think I ran about a 48-second quarter mile. So it was
Wow, all
good. Yeah.
right.
But that to me, that's the analogy. That physical therapy is about rounded the first curve, and these other professions have rounded the last curve and are bringing it home that last 100.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm in Tucson. For those that don't know, the University of Arizona is here, and it's kind of interesting to me. I think this is interesting. I know a lot of the faculty already that are in that program. It's a great program. I think Tucson really is in desperate need of it, so I'm really optimistic about that. But it's a 3-year program, and it was just announced that the medical school in at the University of Arizona, so the same institution, is going to be 3 years now because they're
Oh,
implementing CBE. So, can you talk about? I mean, to me, that kind of worries me a little bit as a profession. If you're trying to seek the best and brightest applicants and they're looking at, well, I could go to PT or I could become an MD in the same amount of time,
yeah.
we should be a little bit worried about that. So, how have people implemented CBE? I know that maybe initially it wasn't designed to reduce the length of the curriculum, but it seems like there are a lot of programs now that, especially in medicine, that are shorter because they're implementing CBE.
Great. I think in my experience, it really comes down to the ability to unsilo these courses. I think that's when, as soon as you start breaking down these individual course silos, you start to realize, and you put them in bigger packages, more clinically focused packages, you realize how much redundancy there is in a traditional curriculum. And there are some things where repetition is good. Repetition, helps with learning. But there's others where you realize after you start to package the curriculum together in a tighter, more competency-based approach, that you had needless redundancies in your program because a lot of the faculty didn't know other faculty were doing these things, in those courses. So just I've always felt that just by definition, that this backward design approach, where you're and it's driven by the domains of competence and the competencies, will by definition eliminate the redundancies in our program. Now, once you eliminate the redundancies, the next level of culling down the curriculum is really what does the industry want? You know, what do we need to teach to make competency based is about making people workforce ready. And we get a clearer vision of what entry level workforce ready is, as opposed to some things that maybe aren't really entry level, or they're not really that much part of practice anymore. I'll give an example. I'll go on the limb right here, and I'll say that anybody that's teaching documentation, 5 years from now, that they're missing the boat of what's happening in the clinic because AI is taking over that aspect of it. I think diagnosis is going to change too. I mean, the workforce ready is the human diagnosis versus the AI diagnosis. Our role is going to be in validating the AI, and that's what we should be teaching now. That's where the focus should be. So I'm only giving those examples because I want to point out that the whole theme of competency-based education is workforce ready. So once you see what the workforce is doing and what they're needing, then that's what you're focused on the curriculum. So the efficiencies, why the U of A medical school can do this in 3 years right now, is because they're making sure there's no redundancies, and two, and they're doing that through a CVE approach, and two, they're focused clearly on what workforce readiness means. And I think that's where the efficiencies, get created. We probably underestimate. We always have underestimated what the students, whether the medical students or physical therapy students, are capable of in the first or second semester. For example, we have sort of a long-standing history of we've got to build all this foundational stuff up. Got to have all the foundational stuff done before you can get it to this next level. But we've learned with competency-based education that you can start in the first semester with complex patients and break it down so the student learns, as opposed to we've got to learn every letter of the alphabet first, before we can start talking. If you think about how people learn a new language, in the old days they learned how to conjugate verbs, and this word equals that word, and then we soon we soon learned that wasn't the best way to learn a new language. You just have to start conversing in it. And it's the same with same way with CBE. I don't know if the parallel is a little bit too wide, but you just got to start doing it. That's what guys start showing the competency. And
Yeah, I
in that,
mean,
yeah, and then, I always say to the students, and say to the faculty, an anatomy exam, for example, and I'll use anatomy just as an example, is not a proxy for clinical competence. It isn't. You've got to test the competency. You got to look at how someone's doing with the competency. The anatomy exam, the physiology exam, isn't a proxy for competence. So that's like language, like being able to conjugate a verb in Italian, okay, is not a proxy for being able to talk Italian. That's why I use the language analogy.
yeah, and I mean, kind of how it reminds me of how maybe I learned to read in school, and then now my kids, they just get this like sheet of paper with sight words, and they just look at the word and memorize what
Yeah,
word that is, and
yeah.
that's kind of how we read.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think competency and entrustment-based education just sort of opens up the window for opportunities. I think um, the the model is competency and entrustment-based education. But just like we're talking about with learning a new language, there's a lot of ways to bring that model to life. There's not just one way, but there's a lot of ways. Just like learning a language, you create different scenarios, and the person learns the language and you have conversation, things like that. There's a lot of ways to figure out how to implement competency and entrustment based education.
Yeah, and maybe so I can hear people thinking to themselves, the NPTE pass rates. What are those? What can you talk a little bit? I know we've maybe talked before about this, but what are your opinions on NPTE pass rates in general? What does that mean as terms of an outcome,
Yeah.
and how that ties into this?
Well, I think what I want to say is I don't want to be taken the wrong way. They're important. I mean, pass rates are important. But I think we, as a profession, sort of just glommed onto the lowest hanging, easy fruit to measure our success. And as a result of that, we've got a whole industry that has sprung up that's just focused on helping students pass the test. I mean, I get emails, as a program director from all of these companies. Let us get in front of your students to prepare them for the NPTE, and so a whole industry has sprung up to help people reach what is seen as the end goal of success with physical therapy education, passing the NPTE exam. And again, it's important, or passing it the first time. Again, it's important. but it really does nothing to contribute to the professional trajectory, the realization that the student has got to have, that now that I graduated, now my learning is going to begin. I'm going to be learning now with patience. Instead, I passed the licensing exam, I'm done, you know, and as opposed to thinking like medicine, thinking, okay, now I have got to really look forward, and when I was a CEO for the orthopedic physicians group, I recruited and hired a number of physicians, and I was really struck by how much time and effort they put in to making sure this was the right position for them. What's the mentorship I'm going to have? These are new, these were, graduates now just out of their residencies. But what kind of mentorship am I going to have? What's the environment? What's the culture? Because they were looking at this as, this is where my learning is going to start, right? This is not, now I've got a job to start paying back loans. Their head was not there. This is where my learning is going to start. Whereas I don't think physical therapists, when they graduate, have that same mindset. Like, I'm going to find the best environment for me that's going to help me continue on my professional trajectory. Some people need mentorship, some people need patient volume, there's all kinds of things that go into that. And so we've shortchanged ourselves as a profession with this high focus. Yeah, it's an easy capty box check. Everybody's proud to put it on their website. 98% pass rate. Well, people could take it 2 and 3 times, so it's an artificial number, and we should elevate ourselves in terms of what outcomes are really, really important. And like I said, that's an outcome, but if no matter how poor a program might be, there's a whole industry out there ready to coach the student to pass the exam. And
Oh,
so I've always had real trouble with us, just putting so much weight on what I consider to be low hanging fruit. It's an easy metric to look at. You don't have to do any work to see where, how students have done post graduation or anything like that. Who's gone on, to me, a more meaningful, and who's gone on to residencies, who was so, who understood their entry level education so well that they went into residencies. That, to me, is incredibly meaningful, uh, um, um, value over first time pass rates.
yeah, and I think one of the reasons that CBE kind of was recommended in this Vision for Excellence document that came out from the APTA was the concept of creating master adaptive learners. And right now, it's just blows my mind. We still only have about 2% of PTs that go on to do residency,
Right.
0.5% or so that do fellowship. So there are all these open slots right now, and it is. I mean, it seems crazy to me. Like we're missing the boat. And I heard the APTA staff, actually a member, articulate a vision where EPAs would be established at entry level, maybe 5 years out of practice, 10 years out of practice. So it would continue after graduation, which to me sounds amazing. Like it would
Yeah.
totally revolutionize Con Ed. It would fill in the residencies and fellowships and kind of elevate our profession.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I see it the same way you see it, Seth. Is there is a the pathway is with a competency and entrustment based model. The pathway from entry level education, to and through residency really is clear. I mean, it really, even a student can see it. We I I'm sort of proud. One of the things that we've done um, with our competency and trust based program is we've sort of revisioned the capstone experience. I think a lot of times uh, when when programs changed to doctoral programs, since there was no thesis, most programs put in place some type of capstone project. And in my opinion, most of these capstone projects that I see are not of value. Testing. Here a student does a quasi research project. They really don't have that strong of a background in research, but they're doing a reliability study on hamstring stretching or something like that, and that's important from a research standpoint. But students are doing meaningless projects. Or what's the effect of heat versus cold on you know, um, jumping rope
Yeah.
or something like that. And I think what the capstone experience should be is preparing people to apply for different residency programs. And that's where we've taken our focus. Our last one, I mean, we're actually to the point of getting students to, and even if they don't go that route, it's in their head that this is the next step. This is your capstone is about your professional identity. That's what a capstone experience should be. If you as your capstone project evolves through a curriculum, it's about starting to learn what your professional identity is. It has how it develops during the curriculum, and then at the end, what your professional identity could be. So I think if we shift our capstone focus to something like that, we'll have less of this, graduates dropping out of the profession because they're frustrated with it. They didn't know this is what it was and things like that. So I would want to encourage everybody to look at the concept of professional identity formation as the capstone experience rather than the effects of heat versus cold on low back flexibility. That we don't need any more of those type studies. And students doing research, meaningless research projects, even survey literature, from a student. I get those all the time, and I go, oh, why are the faculty having the students do this? So that's a strong opinion. But if we focus a little more on professional identity formation as this thread in a capstone experience, that's where we're going to really develop these master adaptive learners that you pointed out.
Yeah. No, I love that. I love that
Mhm.
concept. Carl, if just kind of in closing here, if you had to leave the listeners, maybe it's a, you know, faculty member, program director thinking about, dipping their toe in CBE, what advice or words of encouragement would you give them?
I think the first thing I'd say is be comfortable with ambiguity. I know that's maybe a different kind of phrase, but I think sometimes we as faculty we're like students. Students want it black and white. Yeah, wait a minute. They said that this nerve carries C5, 6, and 7, but this source says it's only C5 and 6, right? They're not comfortable with that ambiguity. The student is. They want to be. They don't like the gray area. And I think faculty are a little bit unwilling to accept that. Is that we've got to explore. We can't be doing things the way we were doing them 30 years ago and 20 years ago. And even, I mean, if we say that 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 new knowledge, comes at like whatever that exponential factor is per day. I mean, it increases, and we're still doing the same thing we were doing 5 years ago in a therapeutic exercise lab or in an orthopedics lab. Something's wrong. That we say to the students, this is science of the art and science of medicine is changing exponentially on a daily basis. but I'm still teaching the same way and stuff that I did 7, 8 years ago. There's a big disconnect there. So we've got to be willing to explore. We got to be willing to create a little chaos. It's sort of like a chemistry formula. It's very difficult when something's at equilibrium. You can't make changes if something's at equilibrium. Okay. When there's chaos, that's when you can make changes. So be comfortable with ambiguity, create a little chaos, and I think we'll thrive, professionally with those kind of mantras.
All right, Carl DeRosa, thanks for your time this morning.
Thanks for listening to Hands On, Hands Off, the official podcast of AOMPT. Subscribe now so you never miss an episode, and connect with us at aompt.org or at AOMPT on social. Opinions are those of the guests and not official AOMPT policy. See you next time.